Welcome everyone to today's AI Collaborative Salon. And we are delighted to have Cade Metz of the New York Times with us. As you probably know, Cade covers artificial intelligence, I'd say broadly, for the Times. But boy, do we have some interesting conversation today because I think we're going to do some deep dives into LLMs and how they train on data and talk about the litigation that's going on and all that sort of thing. So, very interesting salon today. And Cade will be joined by, of course, one of our advisory board members, Thom Shanker. And Thom is a distinguished journalist and national security expert. Spent many years as a Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times, and now serves as director of the Project for Media and National Security at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. And he's also the co-author of several books on U.S. defense and foreign policy, including Counterstrike and The Age of Danger. So, Thom, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce Cade and lead the conversation.
I sure will. Thank you so much, Bill. Even though we're talking AI, I'm still a hopelessly Gutenberg guy. All my thoughts are on paper here. So if you hear a little rustling, that's what's going on. So as Bill said, Cade is a technology reporter for the New York Times, and he's author of a book that I absolutely recommend to all of you. It's called Genius Makers, The Mavericks Who Brought AI to Google, Facebook, and the World. That is really one-stop shopping to understand all of the foundations of what's going on now, and we will talk about that as well. I'd like to kick off because Cade has extensively covered landmark legal action, which Anthropic agreed to pay 1.5 billion to a group of authors and publishers after a judge ruled that Anthropic illegally downloaded and stored millions of copyrighted books. My first book was one of those. Cade mentioned his book is among that as well, and probably half of our colleagues, the New York Times and everywhere, were scooped up. But it's despite being the largest payout in the history of copyright cases, the case is really a turning point, and that's where I'd like to start. So, Cade, once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for your incredible body of work that blows the fog off the distant mountaintop of AI for those of us who don't understand it like you. So to start, let's zoom out. Start with the basics. How are these things built? Why did Anthropic see the need to basically steal voluminous quantities of copyrighted material?
It's a great place to start. In order to understand everything that's going on with these systems, including lawsuits like this one, you need to understand how these systems are built. They're not built the way that software was built in the past. In the past, what you did is you hired a bunch of engineers, some computer programmers, you put them in a room, and they built software one line of code by one line of code. These systems are built in a very different way. They learn their skills by analyzing data. So the classic example is if you have hundreds of photos of a cat, you can feed these photos into one of these AI systems. It's called a neural network. It's just it's a piece of math that can analyze all that data. And it analyzes all those photos of all sorts of different cats. And it learns to recognize the patterns in all those photos. It learns to recognize what a cat looks like. And you can build all sorts of other systems in this way. You can feed spoken language into these systems, the words that you and I say. You can take thousands of hours of technical support calls where you and I are on the phone with a technician. You can take those spoken words and feed them into one of these AI systems, and it learns to recognize the way you and I speak. It learns to recognize the words that we say. And this reached a real turning point with the arrival of chatbots like ChatGPT. And the way those are built is much the same way. You grab as much text as you can from across the internet and you feed it into these systems, and these systems analyze that text and they learn to generate text, to write in much the same way that you and I do. And it's not just about the kind of data that's used, it's about the volume. The more data you throw at these systems, the better they get. And what companies like OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, and Anthropic, who's the OpenAI rival at the center of the case you mentioned, what they eventually did was scoop up literally all the viable text that was on the internet, all the English language text, and fed it into these systems. And that's how these chatbots got so good at doing what they do. That's all sorts of news articles from across the internet. The New York Times, I need to say, my employer is part of a lawsuit against OpenAI and Microsoft over this. It includes Wikipedia articles and it includes books. There are vast databases on the internet of books, some of which are under copyright and some of which are not. And Anthropic, which was founded by a group of people that actually left OpenAI, was found in this case to have illegally downloaded many of these books. They were downloaded from pirated websites, and that was at the heart of the ruling against this company, that they had illegally downloaded these things. There are other issues to discuss here, and we can do that. There are more than 40 court cases that are working their way through various courts across the country, and a lot of these issues surrounding these systems have not yet been decided. But this was a real landmark case that Anthropic was found to have illegally downloaded many of these books as they were building these AI systems.
Thank you so much. I do want to follow up on some of the implications because it does affect a broader audience than book authors and New York Times reporters, however important you and I may think those two classes of people are. If you're a lawyer with a law clerk writing a brief, if you're a corporate CEO who's writing essays, speeches, articles, how does the impact of this suit and what AI is doing affect this broader population, Cade?
Well, when it comes to the data that you use to train these systems, anyone who uses these systems is potentially affected. When you use these systems, you in essence agree to have your data be used in the training of future systems. You can choose to opt out of that if you want, and you can say you don't want your data being used. And that's something that everyone and every business, including law firms, need to think about. As these tools become, a greater and greater part of the way we live our lives and the way we do our work.
I've heard you speak before about one of the downsides. For example, you can do a query to AI, and it might kick back to you a citation from the Times or elsewhere, and that citation is completely false. It's fiction. I think your term for it is hallucination. Can you talk a little bit about that process, which is very scary?
That's something that everyone who uses these systems in all sorts of different ways needs to be aware of. Right? These systems, generate text with what seems like complete confidence, but a certain percentage of the time, they just get things wrong, and sometimes they will just make stuff up out of thin air, and that's a hallucination. These are probability engines. Like I said, they learn their skills by analyzing data. They're essentially predicting what is the best next word to provide at the end of a sentence, and it's based on everything they've trained on. What is the percentage chance that this should be the next word? And what that means is they're always going to make mistakes. You see this when you use a search engine today like Google, which gives AI generated responses very often at the top of a Google search. I'm working on a story right now that shows that about 10% of the time that information is wrong in some way. And as it provides that information, it often will link back to a website saying this is where it found the information. Sometimes those websites do not exist. Sometimes it links to a website that does not have anything to do with the information it's providing. That's just in the nature of these systems. And that's worth remembering um, as you use them, certainly for important tasks. What we've seen very often over the past couple of years is that lawyers in particular will use these systems sometimes to generate entire briefs, and they'll take these into court and they'll be filled with hallucinations in very obvious ways. And it becomes obvious that the lawyers have generated this information without reviewing it. Reviewing the information, providing some human oversight is essential when you're using these systems.
Well, obviously, reviewing is important. In the domestic political space, the phrase fake news is now part of the vocabulary. There's all sorts of programs to teach media literacy generally. When you look at the AI space, whether corporate councils, CEOs, are there ways to become more literate to protect yourself? I mean, does someone need to invent an AI system that fact checks AI product?
Well, those do exist, and you have systems that try to identify when these systems have been used and identify the mistakes. That happens all the time, but it's a real cat and mouse game, right? The systems the systems improve, they get better, they change. The systems that are designed to identify those problems need to be rebuilt. So they're never going to be perfect at identifying what's right and what's not. And it's again, it's on us to use these systems, understand them, and make sure we're not taking everything they're saying at face value. One thing I often say that a good way to really understand what's going on and to prepare yourself to use these systems is to use use them in an area that you know well, right? You covered the Pentagon, right? So someone like you, it's good to go into these chat bots and ask questions in an area that you know really well, and you will see where the mistakes are, and you will see that these things are imperfect. When you're using them in an area you don't know well, it's just not obvious where the mistakes are, and that's where people fall into a trap.
That's very wise counsel. Thanks so much. I wanted to slightly shift. There's been a slew of essays and articles lately about senior AI officials who are quitting or rebelling or speaking out. Can you help us understand their motivations, and do we trust them, or are their minds working in ways that aren't really relevant to the rest of us? It's quite a trend of opinion out there.
It's such a great question. It's definitely worth paying attention to, but what you have to realize is that many of the people in Silicon Valley in general, right, the people who work at tech companies, they just see the world differently than most people do. And in the AI field, that phenomenon is even more extreme. The way I often described it is that these are people who live in the future. Okay, so when they see the latest AI system, when they're building the latest AI system, they don't see what it's doing today. They see what it's doing what they believe it will do in the future. Okay, so like I said, the general trend is that if you throw more and more data at these systems, they get better and better and better. And so many people working on these systems are engineers who just see that trend line and they see it continuing. And they see the powers of these systems getting better and better and better, potentially very, very quickly. And so you need to remember that as we see these type of claims that AI is going to destroy humanity, um, or it's going to wreak havoc in enormous ways on the job market very, very soon. Um, these systems do improve, but they also reach limits. And that's the history of technology as well. Technology reaches a plateau that you may not see, and that's the case with AI. And um, it's worth remembering that these systems do get better and better and better with more data, and that has continued for many years. It will likely continue in the years to come. But we've also seen the progress of these systems slow down in some ways. And it's worth remembering that none of us knows what is going to happen in the future. That's an obvious thing to say, but it's often worth remembering that when you hear these predictions out of these tech executives and AI researchers, they don't necessarily know what is going to happen.
Hmm. But just listening to what you said, again, nobody can predict the future, but you are a well-respected expert. What do you think, or what do you feel will be the impact on the workforce? And how concerned should we be about AI running amok in some manner, whether it's creating a virus or weaponry that should really keep us awake at night?
Well, I think, this is often an unsatisfying answer, but you have to look at this from all sides, and you have to realize that any one opinion here is not necessarily the right one. There's so much disagreement about where these systems will go, and the job market is a prime example. I'm been working this week on a story about these systems becoming very, very good at writing their own computer code, and that has caused a lot of hand wringing among computer programmers, many of whom are worried that this means their jobs will go away. But other people are just as sure that these remain tools used by experienced people, and that whereas these computer programming tools will, most people agree, will replace junior coders who don't have experience, uh, they're very sure that coders who do have experience, who do know what they're doing, are going to thrive with these tools. Many people believe that these tools will actually expand the job market because it will accelerate the development of software. It will allow new types of software to be created, and it will expand the importance of software. And so some people certainly will miss out, but they feel like the entire market will grow. It's one of many things that are the subject of debate right now, and there's not a consensus about where we're going with this stuff.
In military terms, when they talk about AI and automated weapon systems, the Pentagon promises there will always be a human in the loop. And it seems that's your advice as well, that for general counsels using AI, they have to read the briefs, make sure they're accurate. Software will require humans to check the AI software. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. And I've spent the past couple of weeks, interviewing dozens and dozens and dozens of AI researchers and computer programmers about this technology. And even those who make very bold claims publicly about this stuff, they'll admit that today, a human in the loop is essential. That's just the way it works. But they say, but soon it could change, right? The key word there is could. It will change, but it's open to debate how quickly this will change. And it's hard to see in the near future these things completely replacing all people. That's just not how the technology works, right? Even as it improves, it still gets things wrong. There's still that notion that this is a probability engine, and let's remember that.
That's fascinating. I had the great honor of raising two sons, so I've seen just about every single superhero movie ever made. And the Spider-Man rule is with great power comes great responsibility. Can you reflect on AI corporate leadership today? And with this great power, do you see them exercising, like Peter Parker as Spider-Man, great responsibility?
Absolutely. I mean, these systems that are being built in Silicon Valley, they are creating, creating problems, and we need to think about that. You know, we talked about hallucinations on search engines and the like. When it comes to disinformation being spread across the internet, this is a huge problem. It's now very hard to tell the difference between what is real and what is not online. And this is true not just of text, words that are posted online. It's true of images. We now have AI systems that can generate still images and entire videos that look very much like the real thing. And this cuts multiple ways. It is not only creating all this fake information that looks real. This means that some people now, even when they see the real thing, they distrust it because there's the possibility that it's fake. That's a very real phenomenon as well. This creates new ways of attacking computing systems, right? You can, using these AI tools, you can put weapons in the hands of hackers that can be destructive. But at the same time, let's remember that again, this works on both sides. You can empower hackers, but you can also empower the people defending against the hackers. This is the history of technology. It can be used for good and it can be used for ill. And it's always a balance. But we need to remember, as we're building these things, as we're distributing them, as we're using them, that it is creating problems. We've always got to remember that.
A last question for me before I turn to Bill and Scott and invite members of the salon to drop their questions in the chat. The risk that you've just described, Cade, what is your prescription? Is it government regulation? Should the private sector come up with rules of the road? Or is it just a free market and AI is now the Wild West?
Well, I mean, again, there's a huge debate about this. Some people are all for government regulation and really restricting the progress of these tools. Making sure they don't progress too quickly, making sure they're not used in certain ways. But the counter argument, which you often hear in Silicon Valley and in Washington, is that if you restrict the technology here in the U.S., it will just thrive in other parts of the world. And that is true. These are not technologies that are solely the domain of American companies. These are ideas and technologies that have been thriving in other parts of the world, most notably China, for many, many years. And these ideas are relatively simple. Like these technologies, these mathematical technologies called neural networks that learn from data, have been under development for decades. Since the 40s and the 50s, they started to gain steam more recently. But these are well-known ideas that are widely used across the world. And so there is that worry that if you restrict it too much, it'll just empower the rest of the world. And that's worth paying attention to as well.
Fascinating. Bill, I invite you to jump in here.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Let me start with those. The first one I kind of put in the category of unringing the bell. And that is a question about have the firms, I think referring to Anthropic, been instructed to somehow unlearn these books and articles? Is that even possible? And I guess in that litigation, Cade, it was actually a settlement, right? A class action settlement. So although there's some rulings that came out of it, not entirely definitive, I guess. And you mentioned 40 other cases and all that. So still some unsettled law, right? That has to come. But it does raise an interesting question here of, so what if an Anthropic loses the case? What's the remedy other than money damages? And then going forward, the models are trained. They can train more and continue training, but thoughts on that? How's that going to work?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, first of all, the core issue at the heart of many of these cases is it fair use under the law to use copyrighted data to train these systems? Okay, and there are a lot of factors that go into deciding that question, but the basic idea is can you take copyrighted work and use it to train these systems? Are these systems transformative, right? Are they different from the data they're trained on? But another key question is, are they competing, with the companies and people who have the copyrights? And that's also at the heart of the New York Times lawsuit, for instance, against OpenAI. And that notion of fair use, whether it's okay to do this with copyrighted data, is that's a question that's being asked in all sorts of cases, and it was asked in the Anthropic case. The judge actually decided that it was fair use, that it was okay to use copyrighted data, but he came down in another part of the case against Anthropic because of these illegal downloads. Okay, what he found was that they had illegally downloaded the systems, the data, not that they had illegally used it. Okay, and what's fascinating in this case is that Anthropic claims that those illegally downloaded works were never used in the AI systems that they eventually offered to the public. And some people question that, but that's the claim there. What they claim is that after going down that road to download these digital books, they changed course and they bought thousands of physical books, tore them apart, scanned them page by page, and using OCR technology, optical character recognition, convert them into digital text, and then use those to train their systems. So that was their way of getting around the fact that they had admittedly, downloaded these pirated texts. But the other thing and you alluded to this, to think about is that this is the biggest settlement in the history of copyright law, $1.5 billion. To a company like Anthropic, that is a drop in the bucket. This is a company that just raised $30 billion in its latest funding round. Okay, you just need so much money to build these systems. There's so much money that's coming in as they sell them. They deal in figures that are huge compared to that $1.5 billion settlement.
Yeah, I think I saw where the valuation was like 370 billion, for the company. So,
Exactly.
Amazing. And second question here from our audience is about hallucinations. And is it getting better after 2 or 3 years now since OpenAI came out with ChatGPT? Is it getting better, or statistically is it still the same in terms of the error rate?
It's definitely getting better, but it's not zero. I'm working on this, story, like I said, about Google search and other search engines in particular, where we're analyzing how often this happens. And it happens a certain percentage of the time. That's just the way it works. And companies with their latest systems um, can have significantly reduced this, but sometimes they don't use the latest systems because the latest systems are so expensive to run, and they'll use an older system or a system that's trained on a smaller amount of data, and the hallucinations can spike in those cases. Sometimes it's a money issue, but even the latest systems make mistakes. That's just the way it works. These companies will often talk about how when you use a chatbot or use a search engine, they will go out on the internet and grab the information in real time, and that does happen. But even when they do that, they can still make mistakes. So, for instance, if you're asking a chatbot about your law firm, these systems will do an internet search on your law firm and grab that information. But that information just goes into a larger query that's fed back into the system as it decides what its answer is. And it can still make a mistake, even though it's doing an internet search. That's just the nature of these systems.
Okay, I got another one here. This will put you on the spot a little bit here. The public relies on the accuracy of news organizations for content. Are there any media companies like the New York Times that restrict the use of AI to write their stories?
Yeah, I mean, we have very strict rules about this stuff, and I can't speak for other organizations, but this is super, super important. Just as lawyers need to be wary when they're writing briefs with this technology, journalists need to be wary. I do not use ever these systems to write anything. That's just not something that I want to do for various reasons. One of which is that they can make mistakes. And so this is something that journalists need to think about. Do all journalists agree with me? No. There are journalists who use this stuff, and we've seen mistakes from journalists and big name papers and publications that have made huge mistakes because they're relying on these technologies.
Okay, one more, and then Scott, I'll flip it over to you here. But this is another great question. It's kind of the broader regulatory question in the debate back and forth about if you regulate, you're going to slow development of AI, let's say in the US, for example, or the Western world, versus a China where there may not be the regulation and therefore they're going to, surpass us in the race with AI. Any thoughts on regulation writ large?
Well, I mean, again, it's there. This is the subject of huge debate, and there are really good arguments on both sides. Some people, really want to restrict the technology. And one danger there, though, is that if you do that, the technology will be controlled by only a handful of companies. There's a real movement to share the technology openly through what's called open source software. This is how technology is typically been built. You share the underlying software code. Everyone can use it and build off of it. And you can see the flaws in it, and you kind of level the playing field. And there's been a real movement pushing back against the restrictions and saying, look, we really need to share this technology, and that's actually the safest way forward. That can be counterintuitive, but there's a really good argument to be made there. And in fact, in China, the leading companies openly share their technology like this. They open source it. They basically give away, the technology. It allows them to move faster, and it means that people gravitate towards the technology. People often argue if the U.S. does not open source its technology, it stays locked up in these companies, that the rest of the world will just use Chinese tech because it's cheaper, because it's available. They'll sort of standardize on that. So again, there's so much to think about here, and there are conflicting arguments that each hold some truth.
Yeah, good point. Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Cade. I've got a couple of quick questions. Maybe not quick, but on AI in China, we've been talking about. You've been covering AI in America, but what do we know about AI in China in terms of its differences, its purposes, how it's being used, its threats to their own people and to us?
Well, I mean, first of all, like I said before, the same technology is being built in China that is being built here. They have in China one disadvantage, and that's that the chips, the computer chips needed to build this technology, are designed by American companies. So there's these specialized chips. They're called GPUs, and NVIDIA, which is now the world's most valuable company, is the main source of these chips, an American company. As you're analyzing all that data that I talked about, as these systems learn their skills, you need these specialized chips to do that analysis. And we've got in some ways export controls on these chips to parts of the world, and that can restrict what China can do. But they've found ways around that. They're now building their own chips, and a lot of these systems that are coming out of China are on par with what we're seeing in the U.S. There are slight differences in how these things are used, and some of which are concerning. These systems are often used for surveillance in China. That's one issue. And the Chinese government, as it long has done with all sorts of technologies, it restricts in some ways the way these systems behave, right? There are restrictions on what the chat bots can legally say, right? If you ask a Chinese chat bot about Tiananmen Square, it may not answer you, for instance, right? So that's an issue as well.
I notice that I've heard a couple people say that the Americans are going to focus on innovation and they'll focus on application. Is that true? And what does that really mean?
Yeah, that is true in some ways. I'm generalizing here, but in the U.S., in Silicon Valley, there are these incredibly grand ideas about what is being built, and that this is these godlike systems are being built, and there's a danger to humanity, and these are quickly going to exceed what humans are capable of. In China, it's more, the attitude is more that this is a technology that is powerful and we should build applications for it, and we should put it to use in these ways. And it's just more of a practical mindset. I'm endlessly fascinated by this, how in different parts of the US, the same technology is viewed in completely different ways. Like if you talk to people in Silicon Valley about the tech, they'll say one thing. If you go to, the East Coast and talk to people who are just as smart, just as experienced, just as knowledgeable, they'll just talk about the technology in a completely different way. It's really like a Rorschach test. I wrote a piece about this month where, people will look at the technology and kind of see what they want to see in it. It's a fascinating phenomenon.
One last question: universities, how are they going to deal with this? I'm already hearing a lot of problems, with papers And I guess you can't go in and take the test. You ought to have the test in the office again instead of in the classroom rather than on the computer. But what are you hearing about the universities and how they're dealing with this?
Yeah, it's not just universities, it's it's schools, high schools. I have two children, and so I've seen this firsthand. It's a conundrum, right? I'm a writer. I wonder if the next generation is even going to know how to write as they lean on these systems. And there are various ways of dealing with this. We have seen a return to, the test that's taken at your desk without help from a smartphone or a computer, even when it comes to writing essays. But at the same time, the generation needs to learn how to use these systems. They are inevitably becoming part of our daily lives. So people have to be educated in using these systems. Some people argue that they can very much help education.
Yeah.
These chat bots can be used as teachers, and there's a lot of truth to that as well.
I noticed one of the professors I talked to told me, he said, we're back to blue books. And I told a student friend of mine, he said, what's a blue book? So anyway, thank you very much. I think there's more questions coming in.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question on NVIDIA, U.S. company, but aren't their chips manufactured in Taiwan? And is that a U.S. security concern?
It absolutely is a concern. There's long been worry that if there was a conflict, a war between Taiwan and China, that this is a huge vulnerability for the U.S. There's no doubt about it. There's a movement to move more of the manufacturing here to the States, but that's been difficult for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, kind of a long-term proposition. Thom?
Yeah, we have a few minutes left, so anybody in the salon, please drop a question in chat for Bill to see. But Cade, I'd like to ask you, you talk about China and its different approach to AI. Throughout history, the map of the world has been drawn by capitalism versus central planned communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. Do you see AI as being the next defining element of the world map, with countries being drawn to the US model or the Chinese model? And what's the implication for our economy and security?
I think that is absolutely true, right? I mean, it's really reshaping the political landscape. So many people, are beholden not to, a particular political party or particular political philosophy. They're beholden to the technology, and what it might do, either in a powerful way or a negative way. I think you're going to see that during the midterms here in the U.S. that a lot of people are going to put money into super PACs and the like, for instance, just because of AI and where they think it's going. It can empower people, empower companies, empower governments, and it requires so much money and so much infrastructure that the companies building this are becoming increasingly powerful. So you have to think about not only in terms of the the geopolitics of countries, but the geopolitics of business and companies. It's really changing the landscape.
Okay, we've got another question here from the audience. What does it mean to be fluent in AI usage and AI literate, and to be AI literate? Their processes are often referred to as a black box, and those who get closest to true understanding, like computer and data scientists, computer programmers, etc., are most likely to become redundant. How should the next generation try to understand these tools?
Well, I think that if you don't understand them, you will be left behind, right? Again, the computer programming example is a good one. These tools are rapidly replacing junior coders, people who don't have experience. The people who have experience, who understand these tools, who can use them, who can get the best out of them, those are the people who are going to thrive. So you've got to think about it in those terms. You've got to understand what's going on in order to thrive. Again, that's another conundrum. Like if you're replacing all the junior coders, how do they learn to be the experienced coders? We've got to figure that sort of thing out. But as it stands, the onus is on the individual to think about how they can understand and use these technologies.
Thanks. So
Yeah, go ahead, Thom.
I'll jump back in with one more in the minutes remaining. Since book authors are now safe for a while from Anthropic, and since Genius Makers was such a great work, I recommend it to everybody. What's the next book you're going to write to help make us smart on AI, Cade?
I'm writing one now. It's about the culture of the people who have spent decades building the technology and dreaming about it. It's almost like a religion, right? And this has been brewing in Silicon Valley and other parts of the world for decades. So that's what it's about. It's about, it gets to that question you asked earlier about, how do we think about these people who are quitting these companies and saying it's going to, destroy us all? It's about that mindset, right? Which is not something that's new. This is the roots of this are deep, and it's a fascinating culture that goes back decades.
Well, after that book is published, perhaps you'll honor us with another visit to the AI Collaborative to talk about it.
Absolutely, would be glad to.
Bill,
Okay.
Scott, any wrap-up questions from you?
You want to try this last one? We have one more here. Back to the question of professional writers and other creatives. Are there technical ways to reward them when insight from their works is used, like payment for downloads or like Spotify, but a lot more complicated?
Yes, I mean, as all these lawsuits play out, you're also seeing licensing agreements between the AI companies and news organizations and book publishers and the like. And so that's happening as well, where there is compensation. And so you'll see some suits settle in those ways. It's a real push and pull, but there is compensation. Some people feel like these licensing deals don't compensate companies and individuals enough, but that is happening.
Okay, we got a lot of questions coming in. Just a quick follow-on that. I think the question is about how incentivizing journalists, for example, to compete in a sense with these, LLM models and that sort of thing. They're pumping out content all the time. Any thoughts on that?
Well, in any profession, right, there's value in getting things right. There's value in the things that humans do that machines cannot. That's true in journalism. That's true when it comes to book authors. It's true of lawyers, anything else. All right. People in Silicon Valley, the executives at the companies building this technology, they often talk about these technologies like they're people, like they have already duplicated what people can do. These systems are very, very different than the human brain. I mean, that's just a fact, right? They're built in different ways. They're built from different materials. And there are all sorts of ways that our brains behave that these systems are incapable of. And that is worth remembering. In some ways, they're more powerful than us. Let's remember that as well. But that's been the case with technology for decades, right? A calculator is more powerful than us. It can add numbers together much quicker than we can. These systems, in many ways, can operate at a speed that we cannot in certain areas. But there are all sorts of areas where we are very much required, and where we can do things that these systems cannot.
And my last quick question for you is, you interview a lot of interesting people. Who would you say is the most interesting person you've interviewed so far on AI?
Well, I often say one of the most interesting people I've ever met, if not the most, is essentially the main character in my book. It's a guy named Jeff Hinton, and he's a guy who's been working on the idea at the heart of these AI systems since the early 70s, when he was a graduate student at the University of Edinburgh. He came to this idea at a time when no one else believed in it. And over the decades, as people would kind of get interested, but then dismiss this idea, he continued to work on it. He's one of the few people who did. And eventually, around 2010, this idea really started to work. And you're fascinated by him because of that phenomenon, right? His belief in this idea that most of the world, including most of his colleagues, including his advisor at the University of Edinburgh, completely dismissed. But he's also just a fascinating, very, very British academic who has all sorts of beliefs and all sorts of stories that I could talk for days about. And I wrote a book about it in many ways. So he is a fascinating character.
Good. Okay, Thom.
There is one last quick question. We have about 8 minutes left, 7. In the context of AI's impact on business, what will be different a year from now, do you think?
What we're seeing right now is the rise of what are called AI agents. So, these are systems that can take action. Like most of us now are familiar with chatbots that can generate text. An agent can use software, right? It can use a spreadsheet, or it can use a calendar or an email application, or it can search the web. AI systems, like I said, they can generate computer code. If you can generate computer code, you can take actions in that way. And what we're starting to see right now is people starting to use these agents. They're installing them on their own laptops and having them do all this stuff. And right now, that's a dangerous thing. These things go wrong very quickly. They make mistakes, if you're going to run one of these things, you've got to do it carefully. You got to run it on a system where you got to be okay if it's, with it deleting your data, without notice, for instance, or you got to know what you're doing. You got to really restrict what it's capable of. The hope for people in Silicon Valley, and this has been the hope for a while, is that they can perfect these things to the point where they can be deployed in businesses, and you can have these kind of digital assistants that will do stuff for you, right? Send emails for you and deal with your online calendar and kind of make life easier for you. In a way, that's possible, but there's a lot of work to be done there. But that's the thing to keep an eye on.
Thanks. Well, sincerest thanks to all who joined us today for these great questions for the Salon. Thanks to Bill and to Scott, who are the co-founders of the AI Collaborative, and also to Zoe Babbitt, the Director of Programs. But most of all, Cade, this has been a thorough and thought-provoking conversation. We are grateful for your time, and we are so grateful for your journalism, because that's what keeps us all safe.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Cade.
Thanks, everybody.
Bravo.
Okay.
Bravo.
Thanks, everyone.